we go ahead and get started, everybody? Welcome to the first talk of our spring cycle for the VIDI seminar. Um, we are very pleased to have Joel Waldfogel joining us from University of Minnesota. As you should hopefully be able to see on the video part, he is going to discuss a paper entitled "Information and the Welfare Benefits from Differentiated Products." The plan is for Joel to talk about 45 minutes. And then in the last 15 minutes or so, people can ask questions. Joel has said if you have any clarifying questions, like put them in the chat box, and either me or more likely Tommy will um, try to bring them to Joel's attention. But try to keep those only kind of clarifying questions that you need to know to sort of make sure that the talk makes sense. Anyway, without further ado, let me turn things over to Joel.
Thank you so much. And it's good to see a bunch of familiar names and even a couple of faces. And if I don't know you, it's nice to meet you. So yeah, I'm delighted to talk about this paper. This version of this paper is very new, so it's actually still kind of fun to talk about. It's a joint work with Imke Reimers at Cornell and Christoph Riedl at Northeastern. So let me jump into it. So if you think about purchases, think about differentiated products, there's a lot of disappointment and ignorance in this process. There's sort of a generic problem with differentiated products and heterogeneous consumers that it's kind of hard to know what you're going to want and whether you're going to like it. And a little bit of introspection, at least for me, suggests or reminds me of a lot of disappointing purchases. So that's part of the motivation, although that's just an anecdote. But the thing is, data and theory together kind of prevent us from even thinking about this problem. Now, I'll talk about that more in a second, but what are our questions? Our two big questions are, first, how much, now I'm going to put quotes on this for a second, inefficiency is there in current choices? Now, inefficiency is not quite the right word because it's not clear that it can be solved, but how much missed opportunity is there in current choices? And the second question, how much of this, whatever it's going to be, inefficiency or missed opportunity, how much of it could be corrected by contemporary prediction technology if people were to follow those predictions? Now, the two reasons, in my view, our view, the two reasons we really don't know much about this are two. Well, first, post-purchase usage data, it's really rare to observe post-purchase usage. Like generally, we're pretty happy if we have any data at all. You know, it's quite rare to observe individual level purchase choices, and rarer still to observe usage post-purchase. Right? Now, that said, platforms and others know a lot about this. Netflix knows what you started and didn't finish. Amazon and Kindle, they know what you started and didn't finish. Spotify knows what you listened to and didn't listen to and listened to once and never again. But so platforms know this. Increasingly, some practitioner communities know this, but as researchers, we typically don't know this. And so as a result of that, we don't see a lot of suggestions of disappointment and we don't think about it. The other, so there's the see no evil. The other aspect of this, I guess, is on the theory side. If you think about how we do welfare analysis, the standard way, and I do it, we all do it, if a person pays $5 for something, we infer they valued it above $5, and certainly they expected to. But we don't typically, that way of thinking about it just precludes worrying about what happens afterwards. And I'm not saying nobody's ever thought about this. There are some interesting examples, but by and large, we don't think about it because we don't see it, and the way we do welfare analysis precludes analyzing it. So what is needed to study this? Kind of a lot. So if we wanted to quantify, again, this quote, inefficiency, we would need to know a bunch of things. We would need to know how much people valued the things that they did buy. We'd need to know also, a harder thing, how much they would value the things they didn't buy. We would need a way to model the effects of pre-purchase information on choices and utility and revenue, and that's going to be hard for, among other reasons, because it's going to be a multi-product context. We would also need, for the contemporary prediction part of this, we'd need, all of the above, plus some sophisticated personalized predictions of usage for all. Now, just to introduce notation early, I is going to be people and J is going to be products, right? So we need that as well. And this is kind of a tall order, all the stuff on this slide. Now, we have attempted ways to solve all these things. So on the data side, we need to find a context where we can actually observe post-purchase usage. Our solution here is to use game playtime for each of 100 games for 50,000 users from the Steam platform. So kind of by necessity, because of data, this paper takes as its context video games, although I have to say none of us are gamers, so we don't know anything about it, although we've heard quite a bit over the past few months. So we need to create contemporary, in this case, matrix factorization predictions of how much people would play each of the games that they don't own. And then we also need something separate. Besides predictions of playtime, we need measures of true playtime. And just to sort of preface something we're going to have to emphasize later, if we were to rely on the predictions as though they were true, we would think just by by implementing the predictions that we're getting all the welfare benefit available. But of course, we have to recognize that the predictions contain error. So we need a distinction between the truth and the predictions. And even by the truth, I mean the predicted truth for the contexts where we didn't observe it. But I'll talk a lot more about that as we go. On the economic modeling side, we need two things, both of which are kind of big. One is we need a way to think about how pre-purchase information affects the budget constraint. And secondly, we need a way to reduce this high dimensional bundling problem to something super tractable. And let me just give it away now. We're going to think about people as having utility over the cumulative hours of playtime across games, less the expenditure weighted by the value of money. Now, don't worry, I'm going to provide a lot of defense or arguments why that's a reasonable way to go in addition to being tractable. But I realize there's some big assumptions built in there. We're fully aware of that, and we're going to defend it as we go. Okay, so a little roadmap. I'll talk a bit of background about the industry and the context, and then I'll introduce the theoretical model. Then I'll talk about both the underlying data and the predictions, just a little bit about those matrix factorization predictions. Then we'll give descriptive results that I think tell a whole bunch of the story without a whole lot of baggage. And then we'll get to the structural stuff where we can actually do welfare analysis and utility. Okay, so video games. Here's the obligatory I/O slide about how the industry mattering. It's a huge industry, $347 billion worldwide, 2022. In the US, my understanding is, and Mike knows better than I do, but it's I think 34.5 minutes per day, and that includes the people who don't play, right? So that's a lot of time spent with this industry. A lot of money spent, $47 billion. Now, the only way in which we're going to use that is some calibrations we do need an expenditure share, and so we're going to say about 0.5% of expenditures on this, although it's not going to turn out that really matters for the analysis, but still. Now, another reason for studying, and sometimes our real reason for studying, is that this is a kind of a target-rich environment, both in that we can observe post-purchase usage, and so we can say something about that, but also this is a context, and maybe there are others, where regret is common. It's not hard to find people. If you just Google around a little bit, you find all kinds of articles about 25 video games we regretted buying almost right away and so forth. So it seems like the kind of context where one might be able to see this phenomenon if it were true, although we can think of others, and I'll get back to that at the end, other contexts where it might be fun to think about this, but it's hard to think about how to study some of them. Okay, so I think this paper is relevant to a bunch of literatures. I'll just touch on a few. So there is, of course, a big historical literature on the inefficiency or efficiency properties of differentiated product markets. That literature historically has been about the supply side. How many firms, how many products enter? Are they the right products? This is not about that. This is about the demand side efficiency consequences of differentiated product markets. But there is a tradition of thinking about the efficiency or inefficiency consequences of those markets. This is also relevant to the literature on the benefit of sort of large numbers of new products, long tail, and all the rest. There's an interesting literature on pre-purchase information and welfare, just like reviews and stuff that help you find the right things, long before the present day. More recently, people have been using data to think about personalized predictions and their effects on purchase behavior. There's some really cool papers on that. There's the whole set of things on recommender systems that we're drawing on to get the matrix factorization predictions, but there's a large kind of literature and scholarly community that thinks about sophisticated predictions, and we'll make use of some of that here. Then, of course, there's a literature on video games, which we're incidentally about, but it's it's relevant. Okay, so our theoretical model. So here's the way we think about it. Each user is going to be choosing a bundle of games among J possible games. Cap J is going to be 100. We're going to restrict it to 100 possible games. Now, there's an enormous number of possible bundle choices, so this could be a hard problem. But we're going to make it simpler by saying that they maximize utility over cumulative playtime, less the money price, and this is going to make it tractable. So that means what they'll be doing is choosing the games they expect to be best for them, meaning that it'll deliver the most playtime given expenditure. Okay. Now, something that's important here is that users' playtime and utility is going to depend on what they know prior to purchase, because that means that's going to determine how they perceive the budget constraint, what they perceive that different games would deliver them. So again, a really important bit, we're assuming that the marginal utility of games are proportional to the hours that they deliver. And so I will come back to that and provide a lot of sort of direct evidence and even sort of robustness and sensitivity analysis about, but anyways, I'm appreciative that that is a big assumption that we're making to make the problem tractable. Okay, so let's think about this kind of, yes, you are in undergrad micro or intermediate micro. Let's talk about how information affects the budget constraint. So first of all, here's our budget constraint. All other goods on the vertical axis, AOG, and hours of playtime purchased on the horizontal axis. Initially, we have I0 to spend. We're at point A. So what happens if we buy a game? We buy game one. So user I has I0 to spend on A, and H is 0 at that point. That's point A. Then the first game they buy delivers little h I1 for a price P1, and that gets us to point B. Buy a second game, and we get somewhere else. Now, the way this has been drawn, the slopes are going to be increasing because we're thinking about ordering them according to basically price per hour, from the cheapest price per hour to the most expensive price per hour. But the point I want to make on this slide is just that order matters. And of course, information is going to determine whether you know how to order things. Now, let's go all the way to ignorance for a second. Let's suppose you don't know anything about what each game costs. But what you do know is the average price of an hour per game. That's all you know. Well, then you're going to face this dashed straight budget constraint, right? And it's just a dash, and it's steep relative to the initial way that other budget constraint was being drawn. On the other hand, let's suppose you have full information. We use that word a lot. That means you're omniscient. You know everything. So a full information consumer can order. Now we've kind of made things continuous, so we're just going to make it smooth. The budget constraint, the maximally informed budget constraint starts super shallow and then gets steeper. It reaches the same point, but because the person knows which things to buy in some sense first, it's a static model, but I just mean first in the order, the budget constraint is much, much bigger. The area under the budget constraint is bigger than with ignorance. Now, to be clear, we don't think the status quo, in fact, it's an empirical question. We don't think people are ignorant in the status quo. We don't know how informed they are. We need to establish empirically, but our guess is that people in the status quo aren't at the ignorance line, that they're somewhere between the ignorance line and the full information line. But the point is, if we think about the welfare benefit of information, it's really going to be the difference in the value of being on the full information line at that choice FI, full information, versus the status quo choice SQ. Okay, that's how we're going to measure, the benefit once we have an actual empirical implementation of the model. Okay, so that's the whole model, although I haven't told you kind of how we implement it, but that's, in theory, that's what it is. And it's intermediate micro, but with a new notion of the budget constraint where information makes it, fully informed makes it really bowed out relative to being ignorant, making it just straight. Okay, so the data we have, I think I mentioned this, we have 50,000 active Steam users and 100 popular games. So we didn't choose randomly. We chose users who use a lot of games, and we choose games that are used a lot. So because we want to make the matrix less sparse than it might be, we collected these data a while ago, May 2021. So we have this cross-section as of May 2021. We have some information about users and games. We know which games people own. And we know the cumulative hours of play for those games. For the games, we know the average price. We know the game's genre. We know when the game was introduced. We also know a little bit about the users. We know the username, which sometimes allows you to infer gender. When the user joined the platform, and therefore how long the cumulative hours are aggregated from or over. We know the country of origin for many of the users, not all of them. Now, most of what we do doesn't use much information, like matrix factorization just uses playtime, but some other things we'll use some of these other pieces of information. All right, so predictions. So we need to make these predictions. And we're going to call predictions HIJP, that's hours of playtime for person I for game J, and the P is about prediction. So we have this observed truth. There are 100 games by 50,000 users, 5 million sort of numbers we'd like to have. About a third of them are cells that are filled in. People own on average 33 of these games. And so to fill in the matrix of how much each person would use each game, where there's a hat there for a rabbit to be pulled out of a hat, which is sort of how I view this stuff. But in any event, our information systems oriented co-author implemented the collaborative filter with a matrix factorization approach to the collaborative filter. And the fanciest model we use has 100 factors. And it turns out, and I'll show you this in a minute, that this does a pretty good job in the sense of lowest mean squared error of predicting usage and filling in that matrix. Okay, so this isn't really a talk much about that. I'll just show you how the results from that compare with sort of more common sense things that we as Stone Age economists might otherwise have done. Separate from the predictions, right? So we have predictions, we also need truth. Because again, we don't think that our predictions lack error. In fact, we can see for the observations where we observe both the truth and a prediction, we can see the errors. We can see the size of the errors. So for owned games, the truth is the observed playtime. But for unowned games, we need a measure of, quote, truth. And so what we do is we basically add an error to the prediction so that basically matches the correlation of the prediction with the errors for the owned games. So what we literally do, imagine sorting the games, so sorting the 5 million observations. Whenever we have a prediction that's the same as a prediction where we also observe the truth, we stick in the error from that adjacent observation. Now, we do it a bunch of other ways too, but that's our basic way of doing it. But again, it's important. We don't want to stack the deck and pretend that we're getting it right with the predictions. We have to include error to appreciate that the predictions do contain error. Otherwise, we would massively overstate benefits. Okay, so just a little bit about the predictions. The root mean squared error, and it's all out of sample, so we did sort of careful data sciencey stuff here. Going at the bottom of the table, you might say common sense approaches, the things we might, I shouldn't implicate others, but old-fashioned people might have been inclined to do, run regressions that involve either game characteristics or user characteristics or some combination of the two. And what you see is the validation root mean squared error is going from big numbers down to small as we move north in the table. And the point at the top few, so the top few, the matrix factorization approaches, well, what varies across those, am I frozen? Can you hear me? Okay, I'm back. For a minute, I was frozen on my own screen, sorry. You see how the root mean squared error is just getting smaller and smaller. And so the top 4 of them on there are matrix factorization with different numbers of factors in the model, 5 and 10 and 50 and 100. And you see that out of sample, the root mean squared error is smallest using this approach. This is like the kind of approach that was used to win the Netflix prize. And so let's just, if you'll grant me that this is an example of a contemporary sophisticated prediction technology, and again, it works well out of sample, has lowest mean squared error. So, and there may be better things available, in which case we'll just be understating how well prediction can do. But this is meant to sort of be a placeholder for contemporary prediction. Okay, a little bit about the data. So the average price of a game, $15. You see in this table, you have owned games on the left and non-owned games, but about the same, $15.10, $15.28. Then we have the true hours and the predicted hours. These are in log minutes. That's a little... So the owned games have more playtime than the unowned games, which kind of makes sense. People are choosing things maybe they like better than the things that they wouldn't. And the predicted hours are also bigger for owned games than for non-owned games. The other thing to say, I already mentioned this, the matrix, right, there are 5 million observations, potential observations. We have actual data on 33%, on 1.68 million, and we have to fill in the rest with predictions. Okay, so now let me get to, I hope the interesting part, descriptive welfare results. So the first kind of question is, how much playtime could the expenditure I made deliver me? Or how little expenditure could I have used to achieve the playtime that I achieved with status quo expenditure? Okay, and so actually we're going to compare 4 kinds of information environments. One is the status quo, so that's just the observed. Another is full information. Let's pretend they do everything. Another is random. Let's just have them randomly choose games that cost what they spend collectively. And then there's the sophisticated predictions. And so again, we can ask, like, given how much you spent, how many hours of playtime could you have achieved if you were stone dumb, that is to say random, status quo, following sophisticated predictions as though they were the truth, or knew the actual ex post realized truth? Now, the first thing I want to do is just look at owned games. So in other words, let's not even rely initially on any predictions at all. This is just data initially. Let's just look at owned games and order them by the hours you got from them divided by the price measure. And so this solid line in this picture is showing you as a share of expenditure, and this is averaging across people, as a share of expenditure, how much of the playtime that you purchased, you could have purchased with, 20, 40, 60, 80, 100%. And what you see is, now let's arbitrarily draw a line on here for 90% of baseline playtime. That's the horizontal line at 0.9 on the y-axis. What this is saying is you could, on average, or players could on average have achieved 90% of their baseline or status quo playtime with 40% of their expenditure. Okay, now that doesn't prove anything, but it's a little bit of a suggestion that maybe it's a suggestion at this point that maybe they're making some mistakes. Okay, so a suggestive of mistakes, but I want to be careful. They could be enormously valuable, those last few games, so I want to be careful at this point. The other thing in this picture, the dashed line, is what if instead of knowing the truth, the users knew the predictions? And so now they ordered games by their predicted H over P, but then they got the realized H over P. Now, what this is saying is, so if you think about that 40% line, or so think they could have gotten 40%, 90% of their playtime with 40% of their initial expenditure. With sophisticated predictions, they would need 75% of their playtime to get 90%. Excuse me, I'm sorry, I keep misspeaking. They would have needed, so let me say it another way that's a little clearer. Like if you think 90% is a worthwhile objective, you could have gotten to 90% with a 60% discount with full information. You get a 25% discount with predictions. So that already kind of foreshadows much of what we're going to find. First of all, there seems to be a lot of mistakes and inefficiency. Secondly, you can get some chunk of it with sophisticated predictions. Okay, but there's a lot more to say, but that's a bit of a foreshadowing. Okay, how many hours can status quo expenditure buy? Now, the distinction between what I'm doing on this slide and what I just did is now we're also allowing for the purchases of things you didn't buy. That previous slide was just analyzing the stuff you bought and eliminating the regret. But now let's add in the missed opportunities. So now we're leaning harder on the data, the measures of truth, and so forth. So let's start with status quo versus ignorance. So the question is, with the expenditure that you made, and I haven't mentioned, on average, people are spending $508. With the expenditure that you made, how much playtime would you have gotten if you bought things randomly? And the answer is 72% of base time. So people know something in the status quo. They're doing better than random. I mean, of course, it would be shocking if they weren't. But anyways, they're doing better than random. Now, how about the other extreme, full information? If they knew everything, then they could have bought 1.94, 94% more playtime with the expenditure that they made, right? Okay. So that, again, suggests large efficiency losses. The other thing is the sophisticated predictions. What if they followed sophisticated predictions? How much realized playtime would they get? And the answer is 36% above status quo. So it's, again, like 36% relative to 94%. It's like a third, 35, something like that, percent of the full benefits of full information could be achieved through not just having, but following sophisticated predictions. One other way to see it is just to do the same thing in expenditure terms and just say, it's kind of the reciprocal. But what's maybe a little bit interesting is if you think full information here is way over on the right. It says, well, with 19% of your baseline expenditure, you could have achieved baseline playtime. Well, since baseline expenditure was $500, you could have saved like $400. That's already a pretty suggestion. Now, of course, that's not the utility maximizing because you might now buy more or so forth, but it's got to be at least $400. So, back of the envelope welfare analysis is suggesting or indicating this is not going to be a small number. Okay. Now, I want to do some robustness stuff with respect to the descriptives before I get into the structural, because there's some issues that come up and I want to address them. So this 1.942 is kind of the bottom line estimate so far. How much more time could you have gotten with your expenditure? But there are a bunch of things in this environment that we need to worry about. One is we have the average price of games, but gamers tell us games are sometimes free. You're missing that. Okay, so let's worry about that. Another thing is, and I think is big from an economic standpoint, is we're assuming that the marginal utility of games is proportional to the hours played. We better defend that. So we'll do some of that. Another thing is, it could be that the games that were not purchased precisely because the users have they have private information that it would be a bad game for them. So let's see what happens if we shade the predicted playtime estimates for the unpurchased games. Like how much do we have to shade it to make the results go away, right? So I'm going to deal with all three of these kind of concerns over the next few slides. So robustness to free games. What if some of the games had been free, right? So if we think they were paid for and they were actually free, we're going to overstate our effects. And so we should be careful about that. Like, for example, in this diagram, see, look at the upper solid line. What's going on the x-axis is the share of games that we assume were free. If we assume that all the games were free, then there's no benefit. We're at 1. That is, there's no benefit from full information. If the baseline assumes none of the games were free, oh, I should have mentioned, by the way, we know that Steam has a return policy such that you can just send something back if you don't like it, if you don't play it much. We already got rid of the games that were never played, but even putting that aside, and we also cut off the games. We threw out some games to sort of target the return rate as we know it at Steam. But even on top of that, let's go ahead and take the sample we have. Let's pretend 20% of the games were free. That is, let's say that 20% of the least played games were free. Then our 1.94 falls to a little bit. It's like 1.85 or something. Or if it's 40% of them were free, it falls a little bit more. Maybe it's, I don't know, 1.75 or something. But what I'm trying to say here is they'd have to have gotten a whole lot of their games for free in order for the result to go away. So we don't think this is going to undermine what we're going to have as results here. We take the point from gamers that some games are free, games go on sale and so forth, but you'd have to have an enormous share of the games be free to make the results. The result being it's a big number to make that go away. The second one I think is really important is this proportionality to hours. So how do we investigate this? We looked in this graph, what we're looking at is the propensity for each of our 50,000 people to own, for our 50,000 people to own each game. So what you're seeing is on the x-axis, the log of the average realized hours for a game. And on the y-axis, you're seeing the share of our 50,000 folks who own it. Now, what you do see with your glasses on or off is an upward sloping line. So that is, you can say, okay, that's evidence consistent with more hours, more purchase. And actually, you can do a little better than that. You can estimate a logit with a price in there. This is just the raw data. So we could kind of declare partial victory there, but let's go a step farther. Let's think about the deviations from the line as reflective of different marginal utilities. Okay, so instead of thinking of beta times hour plus the CSI in the logit, let's load that CSI onto an omega that's a game-specific weight for the hours. So in other words, if you're above the line in this picture, you should have an extra weight on your hours, and if you're below the line, a lower weight on the hours. And so we're going to come up with these omega weights and do the analysis again with omega weighted hours. Okay, so adjusting hours for different marginal utilities. So let's just doing the arithmetic, the omegas are equal to e to the CSI to the 1 over beta, doesn't matter, but these are just some weights. And then what we can do is we can compute like fully weighted. So in this picture on the right-hand side, the 1 means we're just using the weighted fully, that is the fully omega weighted hours. The 0 is just the baseline. And then we can just have like a convex combination in between to see how big the weights are. But even if we jump all the way over to fully weighted, so we're really giving more marginal utility to the ones that were above the line, the 1.9 something becomes 1.6, right? So 60% increase is still like a big, I mean, like this isn't third decimal place math, but like big, it's still big. I don't know, huge, it's still big. 94 becomes 60. Then the last thing on the robustness before I get to the structural stuff is the robustness to the truth estimate. So we've assumed these equal errors conditional on predictions. But again, the games they didn't buy, maybe like our estimate of truth is too high. They knew something that we don't know, and we should shade it. And by the way, this is like in the matrix factorization collaborative filter land. They don't tend to think about this. They just treat it as a statistical problem, but in any event, let's be economists about it and say, let's shade those predictions a little bit. And so how are we going to do that? Well, x-axis here is the proportionate shading of the realized hours for the unowned games. And so what this is saying is that the solid line is saying is that if you were to, you'd have to shade kind of all the way 100% to make the result go away completely. If you shaded it like 40%, you'd still have kind of a big number. Now, I don't really know what's a What's the right number here? So this is a little speculative. But having said this, remember the analysis of the owned games didn't rely on any of this. So, if you're feeling nervous, just think back to that first picture I showed you. Okay, let me get to the welfare estimates because I still have, I have plenty of time. So in the paper, we do things a few different ways. We do this Cobb-Douglas calibration, which is kind of fun. But I'm going to focus on the logit estimates today in the talk. But I'll show you the other results, but not really explain where they came from. The truth is they're very similar. Okay, so what do we need to do this? First thing we need to do, we need to characterize each individual's budget constraint because we need a budget constraint slope in order to estimate the model. Now, the way we think about this, and this is consistent with the theory model we outlined up front, is we're going to think about an individual specific ranking of games that's based on some combination of the ranking based on the full information, this RT or truth or something, versus a random ranking. And kappa is going to be a weight that we apply on random versus truth to characterize each individual's ranking. Now, how do we find kappa? Well, think about it, like if a person owns, if what they own is what full information would deliver, then that person would get a kappa weight of 1. It's as though they knew everything. If the person owns a number of hours that's similar to what they would get with random, they're going to have a kappa like 0. Okay. Now, it's even possible for them to be worse than random, which is why our kappas run all the way from -1 to +1, and some people are rationalized by worse than random. But in any event, the point is, so we're gonna sort of fit it so that we get a person-specific kappa. Then, using that kappa, we can take draws to simulate their budget constraint, which means we can estimate the slope of the budget constraint at each individual's choice. Now, that's going to be important because in a minute, when we talk about estimating a choice model, we need to say, here's what you chose, and here's what you didn't choose. And what you didn't choose involves the slope of your budget constraint at your choice. Okay, so we're going to consider what you chose relative to 2 increments, more hours or fewer hours, differing according to the price at your choice. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, what this yields for us in some sense, doesn't look crazy. Like the mean slope at the chosen bundles is 50 cents an hour. The median's 42 cents. And the sense in which it's not crazy is the comparison to the utility function estimates in a minute. Okay, so we do logit utility. And so here's the setup. It's super simple. It's beta times log of hours minus alpha times P. Now this P is the sum of the prices of all the games you buy. So it's the full expenditure, just like the cap H is the sum of the hours of what you bought. There's an individual fixed effect. This is a conditional logit. It's being identified within person by the comparison of what you did buy to what you didn't buy. So when we estimate this model, I mean, I guess in some sense it's comforting that we get a positive coefficient on hours and a negative coefficient on money, right? People like hours, they don't like spending money. That's what's supposed to happen. Moreover, the values here are a little bit consistent, right? So if you can calculate the value of an additional hour, and it's 1.266 divided by average hours divided by the alpha coefficient 0.002, that's 60 cents. That's pretty close, like to what we're getting for the budget constraint slope. It doesn't seem crazy. Doesn't seem crazy. Okay, now where do we go from here? What we have to do is we have to calculate the choice and then the resulting consumer surplus on the full information budget constraint, extra word there, I guess, and compare it to the consumer surplus at the status quo. So that's the game plan. And let me just mention 2 distinctions to prevent confusion on the next few slides. We're going to be talking about the effect of full information and the effects of prediction. But we're also going to divide the results into 2 components just for fun. Let's think about the part that comes from avoiding regret and then the full effect. So the part of it comes from, avoiding regret, and the remainder comes from, being made aware of opportunities you were otherwise unaware of. Okay. So the part that comes from avoiding regret. So what we're doing in this slide, first of all, full information. If you had full information, and now what we're doing here is just saying, among the games you bought, what would you do if you were fully informed? And what you would do, so you had bought 33 games in the status quo in the first line, you would instead buy fewer games. you'd buy like 11 games. And it says here Logit and Cobb Douglas. We're talking about Logit. The Cobb Douglas results are very similar. Maybe I should have taken some of them off this slide. But the point is you buy fewer games. You spend a bunch less money. Instead of 508, you spend 150 or 160. You get 250 more in consumer surplus, or 260, whatever. You get about 250 more dollars in consumer surplus simply from reducing the regrettable purchases you made. And that's full information and its effect on regret. Now, what about prediction? How much would following predictions affect your regret? Well, again, you'd get fewer games, not as many fewer, but fewer. You'd spend less, not as much less, but less than with the status quo 508. And you'd get more CS, not all the benefit of full information. You get 70 or whatever instead of 260. But then what I think of, so the overall effect, this combines both the benefit from avoiding regret as well as the benefit from finding stuff you otherwise wouldn't have found. So this is kind of like the drum roll, please result. So full information, buy a lot fewer games, 33, rather than 33.6, you're buying on the order of 15 games. Less expenditure, rather than 500, you're spending 200. You get more hours, a bunch more hours. Instead of 2166, you get 35-ish, 3,500. And consumer surplus goes up by about $650, which we think of as a large number because it's like bigger than baseline expenditure. So that's what's available as additional consumer surplus from being fully informed. Now, how much does prediction do? So you could think, again, like the full information thing is this number of academic interest, how, quote, inefficient is consumption, or how much missed opportunity is there in consumption. But it's kind of academic until you have some way to do something about it. I think it's interesting, but you could argue it's academic. But predictions, well, if followed, they allow about 40% of this gain to be achieved. And so I'm encircling or squaring, if you will, the delta CS for the prediction. It's like on the order of 250, 300 relative to the 600 or so that the full information could deliver to you. Okay, now still there's another piece of kind of important robustness that could have been elsewhere, but I'm going to do it here. So we're thinking about the utility function as having, it's U of it's log of H, and so it's a curved utility function. And if you think about diminishing marginal utility, you might prefer to think about games played during a particular period of time. And we're aggregating many years together because we have people who joined a long time ago. So how about we separately estimate the demand model by join year so that people are at risk of playing for the same period of time. So it kind of makes more sense to think about marginal utility, as getting sick of stuff over the same period or duration of time. And so, again, people who joined at different years are by 2021, they're at risk of having played for different amounts of time. What's interesting is when we do it, the utility function parameters, when we have it by join year, both the beta on hours or log hours as the alpha on expenditure, they're not statistically different across years, which kind of surprised me. And moreover, what this is a picture of is just the delta CS, the average delta CS. The top line is the full information one, which is again on the order of, looks like 650 here, regardless of what year we look at. And then the bottom one is the prediction-based one on the order of 250. So this is not going to kill our result. I mean, this is, the result survives swimmingly with this distinction. Now, we also, I won't probably talk about it today, but we also estimated a model with two types of games. Turns out there aren't that many, there's not that much genre variation in these popular games. So we end up with action and non-action. We estimated a model where we allow the two game types and the hours to enter utility differently, which is kind of a crude version of a substitution structure, but the results are very similar. Even though coefficients are different, the results end up being very, very similar. Okay, so some other things to talk about. I already said expenditure went down, which is another kind of interesting headline result because we're getting a lot of benefit on the CS side, but on the revenue side, it's falling a lot. And if you look at it game by game, this isn't revenue, but rather just quantity purchased. So the status quo quantity is on the x-axis and the full information quantity is on the y-axis. All but 3 games are below the 45-degree line. So again, expenditure falls, or that is purchases fall on essentially, not all games, but almost all games. And it's not like it's concentrated toward the top or the bottom. So although these were all popular games, so it's hard to say what this really does to sort of superstars. But among these games, there isn't a superstar or non-superstar thing going on. But there is a reduction in purchases of almost everything. Now, we could ask, where do the CS gains come from? And so what this picture is doing, it's on the x-axis, we're seeing the change in expenditure. And so this runs from big reductions in expenditure to some small increases in expenditure. And so the black line is the overall effect on the overall change in consumer surplus. And I guess this sort of has to be true, but we thought it was interesting to look at it anyways. Consumers who spend less, well, they're gaining by avoiding regret. I know that because the blue line is the delta CS coming from regret avoidance. And the consumers who spend more, well, they're benefiting from discovering things they otherwise wouldn't have known about. Okay, so that's kind of, maybe that it just has to be true, but somehow I'll say we find it fun to look at this picture. Now, back to the predictions. So we went in with, with our fanciest prediction is the 100-factor matrix factorization model, and that's what's on the right-hand side. What this graph is showing you is the change in consumer surplus arising from following predictions of different levels of sophistication. So it's all relative to the status quo. So like the dumbest prediction you can think of is just user averages, and that's actually worse than the status quo. That's minus $21 relative to the status quo. Following a 10-factor matrix factorization model would get you a benefit of 200. Whereas our baseline, our sort of the model we present has this benefit of 295.2. That was the effect of following predictions on delta CS. But you're just seeing here as you go from observed game averages to using half of the data as opposed to all of the data for the 100-factor matrix factorization, 50 factors with the whole data set, a random forest, which is kind of fancy thing. But you're just seeing sort of the benefit here. Now, there's not so much a bottom line here. It can't be surprising that prediction technologies that give you less error or smaller root mean squared error are going to deliver bigger benefits. But there's sort of some sense in which this tells you the social value. Maybe this is NSF should be thinking how much they should be giving to the prediction guys to, what would it be worth to to get even better predictions. So that was the point of this slide, just to say we can, it's usual for statistics and data science guys to think about root mean squared error, but let's turn it into dollars. What's it worth? That's what this is doing. Okay, so I'm going to come in on time here. Our view, differentiated products choices with heterogeneous consumers, there's a large capacity for disappointment and for missed opportunities. And in this context, we get a pretty big increase in consumer surplus on the order of 150% at the size of baseline expenditure, and a big reduction in expenditure as well. So that's kind of interesting. Now, I should say this now. I meant to say it earlier. I mean, of course, in our analysis, the prices are held constant, and it strikes me that that's not a very good assumption. In fact, if anything, what this analysis points out to me is the reason why Spotify is a bundle, right? So, and the reason why Netflix is a bundle, that, a sort of natural thing that's not directly in the paper, but to think about is that in a world like this, if you can create a whole bunch more consumer surplus for people and you have market power, is it really sensible to think your revenue would fall by 50% or something? Probably not. You might think of a different way of selling that would. So that's all an aside. I should get back to the regularly scheduled programming for a second, but I think it's fun to think about that. So sophisticated predictions allow about 40% the achievement of whatever you want to call this thing, the missing stuff. And lastly, I think it's interesting to think about where else this might apply. What other kinds of products this might apply to. I naturally think about differentiated products, but I've now some labor economists have said, maybe labor markets or housing markets or whatever. But it is. It's super hard to study this because the data needed to do it tend to be kind of elusive. So if you have ideas and you want to share them with me, I'll buy you a beer. Okay, thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks so much, Joel. And I guess we're now at the Q&A part. So anyone who has a question can raise their hand. I think you should be able to unmute yourself, but if you can't, then I'll make sure I do that. So,
Oh, I see Imke's here. Hey, Imke.
So Young seems to have a question. It's a pretty long one. Do you want to ask that? I'm sorry, it's in the chat box. Um, let's see if I can, there's a little
Okay,
too many
sorry,
people.
quickly. I could just quickly say it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this probably falls under like your disclaimer that hours played may not be a perfect measure for the consumer's utility. But I think two things to consider in this context might be really important confounds. One is that some games are just by design supposed to be shorter than others. And that doesn't necessarily, I think, is not necessarily correlated with the utility or even the price for the game. And the second one's that the skill for a particular game or a game type probably correlated with hours played, but negatively correlated with utility. And that might be another important confound to consider.
Yeah, thanks. I'm thinking those are in Omega, but no, those are good specific reasons for Omega to be non one. So if I do things in order, I see Shane has his hand up, but I'm not the host. I'm
I'll jump in.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Joel. So can you see which firms are providing the games that then don't get the play, and which firms are providing the games which unexpectedly get more play than predicted? And in either direction, because it seems like you have a very simple test of two very basic economic predictions about who would be the best firm for predicting what product would be used. On the one hand, established firms would be seeing existing customers and therefore have more information, and so you'd expect them to make mistakes less often and have more second games. Then the other prediction is established firms would have cannibalized rents that they'd be worried about and therefore wouldn't cannibalize their own product, and therefore you'd get more entry from firms coming with something unexpected that substitutes for them. And that would come from firms without experience. And so it seems like you have you have enough to say something about that.
So that's super interesting. I think the way we constructed the sample would make it hard to study that just because we chose 100 games that are really popular. But I agree. I think it would be very interesting to think about kind of the firm's incentives looking at their game portfolio and even thinking about like even that bundling thing I was alluding to. So I agree, but I think the way we constructed the sample, it would be hard to say much about. We could try, but I worry. Yeah. Larry.
Yeah, just one immediate thought that comes to mind is looking at returns data with real good, not digital, but real goods. There's a burning up of resources that happens because people regret whatever. Now, some of that may be this is going on less and less, but I order 5 different sizes because I'm not quite sure which one is going to work, and then I return the other 4. But still, there's a burning up of resources that has to be going on, and there's got to be some data on that as well.
No, that's good. And by the way, I can't believe we've gotten this far without talking about Christmas. I mean, what we're trying to do here is for the rest of the year, do for the rest of the year what, whatever.
Yeah.
Han.
Hi, this is fantastic. I don't think my question is particularly well formed, but I think it relates to Larry and Shane's question in the sense of I kept on thinking about yogurt. So if I like buy yogurt, if I don't like it, I don't have to buy it again. So in that world, it's very different from yours in the sense of the sunk cost payment is not very expensive, etc. But in the extreme world in which buy a house, ignoring the sort of the richness of information for a second, that is the situation where like your model, like the way of thinking is most relevant because you want to minimize regret because of the expenditure is so big. So then like if I think about video game, expenditure is probably positively correlated with quality as well. I don't exactly know where my question is going, but I'm thinking about different kind of regimes, different worlds in which like you can have very expensive video games with high quality, whereby the potential regret is higher, so your analysis is more relevant, but it is also a world in which quality is higher, potentially, that may mitigate certain regret. But in another world in which we produce like cheaper games, like who cares? Like if I buy a cheap game and I don't like it, I like ditch it, right? Like yogurt world. So I guess it's more like whether you have the data to say something interesting in terms of comparative statics in those two worlds, and then probably from producers' perspective, what are the implications for them to think about like managing different roles in which, like the potential inefficiencies may or may not be relevant, and then you culture it, you nurture a world in which you do allow for a lot of experimentation, without too much regret because the expenditure is not, price is not too high.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts, just sort of free-floating thoughts for your interesting free-floating thoughts. One is, so this is a digital product. So in some sense, there's no deadweight loss. I mean, there's just, maybe there's a triangle somewhere, but it's like not like elves worked hard to make these things. So in some sense, it's, to the extent that when we think about this problem, we've been thinking, well, it's interesting that people could get more utility from less stuff. But of course, there's no stuff here. So what's a context? Yogurt's not a good context. I agree with you. I tend to think about my closet and all my clothes that I bought that I wish I hadn't bought. And so that's where I could have more utility with less stuff. Now, to your point about like expensive games, I mean, one thing I mentioned, but I was sort of fast about it, is Steam allows you to return any game you've played less than 2 hours. So in some sense, some part of this problem should be self-correcting. And but nevertheless, what we did is we eliminated all the games that weren't played at all, and in fact, eliminated all the games played less than a certain number of minutes to target the reported propensity for people to return games. But all this, I mean, none of this really fully addresses, what you're saying. You're just sort of like, there's an interesting problem for producers, and they have to sort of balance what's the marginal cost of making their thing, and what does it cost to do returns. And digital products are pretty cheap. The only thing to worry about is cannibalizing your own revenue. Maybe, I don't know, maybe 2 hours is not the right amount. Maybe it should be longer. Maybe you should be able to keep a game for a month to make this problem go away. I mean, then you have to worry a little bit about how do we value the time people spend experimenting with it, because that's socially valuable too. But anyways, no, thank you. I mean, that's fun stuff to think about.
Joel, let me leap back in and partly build on what Hong just suggested. One goes to the world of services, and then there's no returnability. But gee, if I've spent $N,000 on a vacation that just turned out to be horrible, that's entire. I don't know what, is that a triangle? Is that a rectangle? But man, that's a major loss versus spending $60 on a haircut. But there, of course, I have a couple. If I don't like the haircut, there's a couple of. I may have to wear a hat for a few weeks, or some other forms of regret. So it feels like there's sort of lots of opportunities to be thinking creatively. Again, where the data might come from on any of these regret things, I'm not sure, but just feels like a lot of opportunity here.
Well, I mean, this morning I was at the Consumer Reports website, and they do a survey of car owners asking what share of you would buy it again, and it varies a lot across models and makes, and that smells like regret to me.
Yeah,
numbers. Yeah. I don't know where to draw the threshold, but
yeah. And again, as Hong mentioned, you buy a home, if you regret, in some sense, you can resell. There'll be all those transactions costs and the 6%. Well, that's going down. Real estate brokerage fees, etc. But
yeah. And by the way, Imke, if you want to say stuff, please please jump in.
Okay. I have two questions, if I can. One's an easy one. Is that is there any evidence of learning? Are people getting better at making their selections over time? So are they making predictions better? And you can do that. You can do that. The harder one is for these games usually have add-on downloadable content that's game specific. And I don't know if you have data on that, but that purchasing that suggests that you have more marginal utility from that game than you would have thought otherwise.
Oh, that's a good, no, so we don't see that, although I don't, but that's a good point. So if they like it, they're probably not going to buy, stuff for their avatar if they didn't enjoy it. So that might be another way to get it. The learning thing, one thing we did is we looked at the difference between people who had joined earlier and later, thinking the people who had joined earlier have more experience. And I think we saw it's kind of modest evidence that if you think about our kappa parameter is related to how much information they have. So it looked a little bit like they had more information. They were closer to full information, budget constraint. But I don't think that was a super resounding result.
That would be average over a cohort as opposed to change over time.
Yeah, we were averaging over cohort. You're right. It would be. We can't really do over time because we have a cross section. We don't know exactly when people bought what. So, but I with the exception that we do observe a panel for a year, but not enough happens, I don't think. But I do like the idea. I like the idea of seeing if they get better.
Yeah, I think a follow-up on that is, they could learn about what they want, what kind of games that they like, but at the same time, they may get stuck to one type of game and then never try the other stuff, right? So for those who joined the platform like 10 years ago, they just play RPG game all the time, and then they never tried the other types of game. I don't know the game genre really that well to name out an example, but
sure.
Yeah, I think you know what I mean. So
yeah.
You maybe, well, from the results that you run the regression by join year, I think there's not much difference in terms of the consumer surplus gain, right? With the full prediction. There may be these two counteracting things going on at the same time.
The other thing that's related to this that we in principle could study, but I don't know in fact how we can, is that over time, Steam provides more and more personalized information. If we, in principle, like there's an interface that presents different people with different information and recommendations. And it could even be, so, I kept saying in the talk, this is the effect of personalized predictions if people were to follow them. They may already have them and they're just ignoring them, right? So that's an interesting, sort of, even if we can do a great job, it only works if the people follow it. But separate from that, there is an interesting question of, have people gotten better at this as they've been presented with better information, which I don't think is an answered question by us, but it's an interesting one.
I got a quick question on the modeling. I'm very unaware of video games post Defender, Pac-Man, so I'm like many years out of date. But I'm putting this in the context of music, and I would think that there should be a taste for variety as opposed to overall hours. Like I have a stock of music, and I have some very unplayed albums, but I really appreciate having those in reserve to play at some point, even if they're, these would be whatever, low hour ones. I don't know. My sense is this to the extent that that's important, the approach overstates the gains to information. And I don't know. I don't know. I wish I had a more constructive suggestion on how to incorporate something like that.
So here's a thought, maybe. The curvature of the utility function is one interpretation of that is it's about some combination of taste for variety and getting sick of stuff. But maybe we could estimate it more flexibly than we do, because we estimate it in a pretty restrictive way that imposes its beta times log. We could do something exponential maybe, which would, the point of it with respect to your comment is it would be a little more flexible to allow, like, if variety swamps getting sick of stuff, then it's going to be less curved over, presumably. It's going to be closer to, that's just my initial thought. So I'll think about that some more, as will Imke, right?
Maybe this is my chance to say something too. We did at some point think about this having different utility parameters for action games versus non-action games. and allowing those to kind of be treated differently. I think the functional form we're using doesn't exactly go to your point, but it's a first step as well. So we have this analysis that I think Joel kind of skipped over in the presentation.
Yeah, I need to, it was not clear to me, you know, you say getting sick of stuff, I think of declining marginal utility from playing the same game again and again and again and again and again. And so, you know, clarifying that would be really useful.
Yeah, I mean, the closest we get to that is to separate people by when they joined. So at least we're looking at play that occurred at the same, in some sense, in the same time interval. But it's not clear that we can identify the sort of the separate effect of different games. I mean, that's sort of the devil's bargain that we make to get tractability.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more hands. We're kind of actually even past time a little bit. So why don't we officially wrap up, I guess, at this point? Oh, we have one more quick comment. I know Just has a comment. Do you want to jump in? We have like one last comment.
Oh, well, I think we're at time, right? But one thought that kept on popping up in my head is, you know, some games have positive demand externalities because they have large online multiplayer modes, and so that's going to affect playtime for some of those games. I wouldn't know how that, you know, affects your modeling, but it could be something to look into.
I tend to think of that as something that would go into changing the relationship between hours and the propensity to own it. So I'd like to think of Omega as being a way to address that. But I guess another way to address that would be to estimate the model without multiplayer games and see if see if the results look similar.
Okay. All right. Well, I think then we should probably thank Joel at this point, because we are, I think, now officially past time. So, and thank you everybody for joining in, and we will reconvene in a month for our next talk.
Well, thanks everybody for the comments, and thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun and very useful. I took notes, see?
Great. Yeah, and I'm trying to copy all the comments in the chat box to send you if you don't have those. Yeah, my Google skills are not great. So I'll follow up with that for you, Joel. I'll just send you those. I'll send you the chat box stuff. Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, Joel.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
Good stuff, Joel.